Hello, guys, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 2, Fiction or Nonfiction, with Molly McTernan. Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Inked Podcast. Today, we are starting off our season about genres by talking about fiction and nonfiction, and how you decide which fits you the best. Here to help me talk about this today is Miss Molly McTernan. So, how are you doing today, Miss Molly?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
I'm so glad you're doing well. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Molly and her work, Molly is a daughter of the king who loves good books, folk music, and being outside. She writes sweet and soulful stories, poetry, and loves connecting with fellow creatives. When Molly isn't writing, she can usually be found reading, playing her violin, or spending time with her family and many pets. Molly is also the author of Poetic Surrender, a faith-based poetry collection, and has had work featured on The Revolution, Unlocked, Keys for Kids, and Havoc Publishing. You can find links to all of her past published pieces as well as all of her platforms, including her monthly newsletter, on her website mollymcternan.com. Currently, she's working on a magic realism novel and can almost always be found drafting a new blog post, poem, or entry for a writing contest. So, welcome to the show, Molly. I am so excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very, very excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're excited. When y'all are excited, it just makes me so happy. So now that we have a little bit more background on who Molly is and why she is here, we obviously are going to be talking about genre for this entire season, and one big thing that we know as authors is that all genres have to fit into one of two categories: fiction or nonfiction. So, for those of you who aren't super familiar with the terms fiction and nonfiction in the context of writing, fiction normally means that the work is obviously fictitious. It is made up, or it is more on the pretend, make believe side of things. While nonfiction is more your real life stories or just factual things. So, like your biographies, your encyclopedias, devotional books, etc. So, those are just two terms that are very largely used in writing. And today, Molly is going to help me break these down. So, are you ready to just jump into our questions for today, Molly?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Well, our first question is, I have told Molly this before. She is the living embodiment of the answer to this first question. And our first question for the day is, can you write fiction and nonfiction?
Yes, well, as she just said, I do both, and so you definitely can do both as well. I especially think that if you are a fiction author who is wanting to eventually get published, it's actually almost a necessity to do both, because you'll have to learn how to do things like write emails, captions for social media posts, maybe even be featured on a blog with an interview. So just as a marketing aspect, even for your fiction work, it is very important to know how to do nonfiction too. And in addition, just for like daily life and just to enhance your own writing, I think it's actually a really good thing to try doing both, because fiction writing is very imaginative. You can do a lot of brainstorming, and kind of you have more. You don't have as many boundaries, kind of, as you do with fiction. Like with nonfiction, you have more boundaries to it, and so you have to be more technical, kind of. But it can help to write nonfiction and have that technical writing style, and then get to build upon that with your fiction. So you can definitely do both, and I would actually encourage you to do both, to help your writing in general.
Yeah, I agree with that. As someone who has had to learn how to do nonfiction writing, like you said, for social media, for like reaching out to people, for email lists, that kind of thing, all of that is, I definitely agree. I've had to learn how to do that as a fiction author myself. I've had to learn how to kind of format things in a little more of a nonfiction way for the sake of realism, and like when you're working on particular projects that don't necessarily always pertain to your writing. So yeah, that was a great answer. First of all, that was awesome. And sliding into our second question, which this is one that I feel like is a like okay, it's kind of a rough question to ask because I know that you've just said that you do both. So, do you have one that you prefer? Like, do you prefer writing fiction or do you prefer writing nonfiction?
Yes, this is a very hard question for me to answer. Um, I really like different aspects of the two. Um, like with nonfiction, I love blogging and I love writing emails. So in that regard, I love nonfiction. But with fiction, I really love coming up with characters and all these deep themes. So in the end, I think I would have to say fiction, but I do both almost daily, and I'd say it's pretty pretty close to being even. But yes, in the end, I think it would be fiction.
I agree with that. Sometimes when you do nonfiction, while it can be really fun some days it's just a little tedious and like a little more factually focused. And I feel like with fiction you can kind of let your creative brain, a lot of authors are just really creative brained. And so with fiction you can kind of let your creative brain run free a little bit.
Yes, definitely agree.
Um so speaking of writing both, you've obviously said that you have different feelings about both. But do you have like almost a different personality entirely when you're writing fiction versus nonfiction?
Um, this is a really interesting question to me, and I hadn't really thought of this before. I'd say I don't necessarily, but I do have a different kind of writing style for each of them. And like I mentioned before, actually having that more technical nonfiction writing style has helped build up my fiction writing style. But as far as like personalities go, I wouldn't say so. No.
So that's really see that's kind of what I thought when I first like thought about this question. I was like this is really interesting because maybe I'm the only person that's like this. Because when I do my nonfiction writing for like emails, reaching out to possible guests for the podcast, like blog posts, newsletters, like things, scripts for the podcast itself, the I'm almost more bubbly in those than I am with my actual writing because I'm someone who writes dystopian a lot. And so like my books are almost always really like dark and depressed and like not really dark and depressed. Like it gets better, I promise. But it's like the initial just the personalities of my characters, like even though they're part of me, like when I'm writing characters, they almost are, always have like some parts of me. I feel like they almost always get the darker parts of me. And like when I'm doing my nonfiction, like reaching out to people, emails, stuff like that, I'm always like, oh my gosh, like I'm so happy you're here. Like even on the podcast itself, when I'm like talking back and forth with you guys, I sound happier than I do in real life. Um, which I've talked about this with people before. Because it's almost like having a customer service voice. That's what my dad calls it because he'll hear like I'll say something to him in the middle of I'll silence my mic and like say something to him if he asks me something during a recording session, and then as soon as I'm done talking to him I'll turn my mic back on and then like my voice goes really high for some reason, and it's really interesting just to see how your personality changes based on what you're writing. um but no, I understand why your personality wouldn't swap for that. I'm just weird, guys. I'm just weird.
No, no, it does make sense. And that's an interesting point that you brought up.
It's definitely interesting. That's for sure. Um, so going into our next question, which this is something that I personally do a lot, but it is: do you ever find yourself mixing the elements of fiction and nonfiction?
Oh, this is another thing I haven't really thought of much. Um, yeah, I would say not necessarily. No, I really like to have very devoted writing session times. And I'll set aside certain times for when I'm writing my newsletter or when I'm writing my blog post. And I usually do it pretty start to finish. So once I attempt writing a blog post and I finish it, I'm kind of done with nonfiction then. And I can pretty easily start working on my novel for the day or write a piece of flash fiction or a poem or something and just kind of switch gears. So I'd say no, not necessarily.
That makes sense. I understand that part of it definitely. So here's the thing. I find myself doing that a lot, mostly because I have ADHD, and I swap a lot of my attention span back and forth. So like I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna sit down and write this stuff for the English podcast, and I'll like write scripts. I'll message people answers to their questions. Like I'll set up sign up sheets, whatever. And most of the time I'll do that for like an hour, and then I'm like, okay, I need a break from this task itself, and then I hop over, and then for some reason my things just start melding. So like I'll be working on a work of fiction, and then suddenly they'll just start melding, and like my inked podcast script goes from hello guys and welcome back to the inked podcast to hear ye, welcome to yet another day in the inked podcast. Like I don't understand how those things end up mixed together, but they do. I do it a lot. um, so going into our next question, which this is a little more of a process-based question when it comes to fiction versus nonfiction, and that would be, what are the main differences in your like writing process when you do fiction compared to nonfiction?
Yes. So for me, I by nature, I am more of what's like a pantser for writing, which basically means that I like to write by the seat of my pants and kind of make things up as I go, versus like actually plotting out what I'm going to write. I have started plotting more of my fiction lately, but nonfiction has always been easier for me to plot, and it's been easier for me to go off an outline. So that's a very big difference for me for process. Like I almost always have at least a bullet point list of things I want to hit in a blog post or in an email. Um, Whereas fiction, I usually have a general idea of where I'm going, but I don't ever know exactly. So I'd say that's probably the biggest
Yeah,
difference.
that makes sense. And if you guys want to know more about what Molly's talking about when she says pantsing, if you guys are one of those people that are hopping around the podcast, I would say go back to season 1. We have a whole episode on what pantsing is that was guested by Miss Genesis Duran. We absolutely love her. So if you guys want to know more about pantsing and how that process works, then go back to that episode. Genesis had lots of great advice about that. Um, and yeah, that makes your process definitely is going to change based on those two things, which I find that interesting that you said that you can go more often with like an outline when you're doing your nonfiction than when you're doing your fiction. Like that's really interesting to me because I'm the other way around. Like I'm a planner. Personally, I'm a
Oh,
planner. So I tend to be able to go off more of an outline for my fictional writing. But when it comes to my non-fictional writing, I'm pantsing totally. Like I'm just like, okay, like, all right, topic. I know what I'm doing. Like, here's my spiel. That's it. I'm done. So that's really interesting to me. Um, so we are almost out of time for this episode, but I am going to go ahead and end out with a great question for just our listeners in general. What would you say is your biggest piece of advice for when you write both fiction and nonfiction?
I would say one of my biggest pieces of advice is actually to keep them different and like separate. Um, I think, like I said, I think writing nonfiction actually can enhance your fiction, and it can be used for marketing later on if you need it to. But I'd say just keep practicing both of them, and yeah, try to have a defined style for nonfiction and for fiction, and I think that will actually help each other out. But yeah, definitely experiment with both, um, and enjoy it. I really enjoy getting to experiment with different writing styles and genres, and yeah, I think it's just really good for your brain.
Yeah. Well, this was a great way to go ahead and kind of kick off our season on genres. So that is all the time we have for today. So thank you, Molly, so much for being here. I'm so glad you could come on.
Yes, thank you so much for
I'm so
having
glad you
me.
came. You have no idea. And that is all the time we have for today. So thank you to our listeners, as always, for being here. And we will see you in the next episode. Bye, guys. Hello, guys. Just coming back into this episode to let you know if you enjoyed hearing from Molly, that you can find more about her and her work at her website, mollymcternan.wixsite.com. I will link it in the description box below so you guys can go check that out. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Bye, guys.